family.
Morning.
It's great to be together. I appreciate what Michelle shared there. I'm gonna tell her that when she's gone. And I just appreciate just her being heartfelt and sincere and emotional. And I've got about 8 or 9 pages of notes here, and I promise you I'm going to cut it because, as a good friend used to tell me, the brain can only absorb what the bottom can endure. So he said no sermon should be longer than 30 minutes, so I'm going to shoot for that. I'm going to cut some stuff out. And she gave me a great reason to cut out large chunks because there are parts that are emotional for me, and I can't get there now. So
It's double space money. It's not that long.
And the box of tissues.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, I'm not going there this morning, not at all. It's great to be up here. This is not something I enjoy, and the less and less I do it, I enjoy it even less. So typically for me to be up here, it comes from a lot of nagging and encouragement. And when I say encouragement, I mean Carolyn encouraging me to be up here. And when I say nagging, I mean the Spirit. And I say that because a few months back, I had, first of all, I want to let you know the subject of what we're going to talk about today is shame. Woohoo!
Yay!
But not only are we going to talk about shame, we're going to talk about guilt as well.
Oh, awesome.
And again, the Spirit was nagging on me because months ago we took a road trip down to see Carolyn's father. And Carolyn was driving, and I'm sitting in the passenger seat looking out the window, and I'm realizing we're not in Vermont anymore because there's billboards everywhere. And we entered into Connecticut, and I was remarking about billboard after billboard after billboard, and it's all personal injury attorneys. Yeah. And I'm trying to figure out what does Jared Goff have to do with personal injury, because he's all these billboards. He's the quarterback for the Detroit Lions, not even from Connecticut. What's going on here? And as I'm going, kind of thinking that through, I see this billboard. It's very simple. It's black. All right, it's a white billboard with black lettering, and it says, "Jesus takes away our shame." And my first reaction to that is, well, thanks, Captain Obvious. Even the non-religious believe that or see that. And I started thinking about it more and more, and the Spirit's nagging me and telling me, just keep thinking about this. And I started thinking, well, maybe that's not what they're trying to tell us. They're not trying to communicate the obvious. And so I started thinking about, what are they trying to communicate? And through the months, the Spirit keeps nagging me. Carolyn found an article that she clipped from a magazine 30 years ago, whatever, on shame. She was cleaning out her drawer and found it. And then I started being nagged by the Spirit because he threw some things from Marty Solomon, who many of you know from Bayman Discipleship, just talking about shame. And then I saw an article or a quote from Brene Brown. I'm not a huge Brene Brown fan. I appreciate what she does. Carolyn loves her. And I'm not sure why some of the stuff rubs me wrong, but there was a quote that was spot on shame. And then I was reminded of an argument that I used to have with a campus minister when I was a young Christian at Colorado State about guilt and shame and godly sorrow. And then we had an article written by Bessel van der Kolk, who's a psychologist, and he talks about the concept of guilt. And his article just reaffirmed what I used to argue with this campus minister about. And so I'm thinking, come on, I really don't want to be up here in front of you. The intention was to be in Psalms 51 and then John chapter 7 and 8, because we're supposed to be studying from John. I think I'm going to maybe this is just the Spirit set me up so I'll have to do a sequel. Now, I'm not a psychologist, psychiatrist, or guilt and shame, but I think I've read enough, and the Spirit has sent me down so many roads recently that I really want to talk about it. I'm not here to teach anything for those who are well-versed in psychology, sociology. If there's anything I'm saying that's just wrong, let me know. Even bring it up afterward, because I think we all should be able to learn from it. We should just, it's based on Malcolm Gladwell's rule of the 10,000. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. That basically you can't be considered an expert unless you're supposed to be an expert at something. There has to be work put into it. And he's come back since then and has qualified all that. But if if 10,000 hours qualifies me as an expert, then I can be an expert in shame, because in 59. So, what does it mean, this billboard? Jesus takes away our shame. And I kept thinking about that and going through all these references from Marty Solomon and Brene Brown and Bessel van der Kolk. And I figured the best place to start in looking at guilt and shame is to look at especially shame, is to look at the definition of shame. So I went to Webster's, and Webster's says that the definition of shame as a noun is a painful feeling of humiliation or distress caused by consciousness of wrong or foolish behavior. As a verb, it is the process of making somebody feel ashamed. That's a pretty basic definition, and so I started to look at the professionals, how they defined it. And Brene Brown has a definition, Marty Solomon has a definition, it's more religious definition, and they all agree in their definition that shame creates separation. That shame creates isolation. It keeps us away from other people. As we feel shame, as we experience shame, we don't want to be around other people. And as Brene Brown says, it creates this sense of non-belonging. When you're experiencing shame, you don't feel like you belong to anybody. You can't relate to anybody. Nobody knows what I'm going through. Nobody can identify, and nobody can empathize. And so it just isolates you and separates you, and you're doomed at that point. And that's why it's such a powerful emotion. And I used to, growing up, I used to think that guilt, and both Carol and I, our parents divorced when we were 10 years old. And I know that my dad, my mom moved out, taking us to counseling, and I didn't want to go. I hated it. And it was group counseling, it was peer counseling, it was one-on-one counseling, and I didn't want to be there. And it frustrated me because they kept telling me what I should be feeling. And they were, prompting me to, say, yeah, I feel just numb. And I would get more and more frustrated. And growing up in our house, guilt was used as a manipulation or a motivator or whatever. And I didn't know at the time, I didn't feel the guilt, but I did feel the guilt. And I couldn't acknowledge it, I couldn't recognize it. And I just remember my mom would often say things that would guilt the kids into spending time with her doing something. And she used it to manipulate us. And so even though I didn't truly understand it, by the time I got to college, I had that taste in my mouth, and I hate guilt. Guilt is horrible. And I remember, feeling shame with my parents. When I, fast forward to when I'm in college and I'm started attending church, and I get baptized, and then they asked me to lead a Bible study in my dorm, and I'm a young Christian. And at that point in my life, I wanted to be bigger than something, be a part of something bigger than me, sorry. And so I started leading these Bible talks, and the way it worked is the young guys would lead a Bible talk in there to help out. And I always dreaded that, because if he didn't like the way it was going, he'd take it over. And so I'm doing this study, very similar to what we're going to talk about today, on David and Bathsheba. I'm looking at it from the perspective of guilt, or godly sorrow and guilt, godly sorrow and worldly sorrow. And I put it out to the group that I don't believe in it, and we miss the mark, because religion, or in our relationships, we use guilt as a tool to manipulate people. And I think we miss that godly sorrow brings repentance that leads to salvation and leaves no regret, but worldly sorrow brings death. And I think about all the instances that I had with my mom, and in religion growing up in the church, guilt was a tool to manipulate people. It didn't produce, it may change behavior, but it didn't change the heart.
Right.
And it may change the masses, but it doesn't get us. And I had this conversation with the campus minister afterward, and he finally got me to acquiesce that guilt was good and that sort of thing. And then I moved to Denver, and was still in the campus ministry. And fortunately, I had some affirmation from an elder in the church, and so I didn't really acquiesce at that point. But And even Marty Solomon says shame is bad, and I don't believe that's right. I don't think shame is bad. It's not fun. It's not something we look forward to going through. But I don't think it's bad. I think it's part of the process. So Brene Brown defines shame as a painful feeling of being flawed and unworthy of love and connection, which pretty much matches Webster's. She also said that there's the belief that making a mistake is I am bad, when guilt is I did something bad. And I struggled with that before, and then I heard Marty Solomon, address the same concept, and the way he poses it is there's a life cycle, he calls it a life cycle or a life cycle of recovery. I love that. And he says that the life cycle of recovery starts with guilt. We feel guilt, and that guilt, if it goes to shame, and it goes from I did something bad, I stole, to I'm a thief. Guilt that you did something wrong, but in shame, you become that thing. And again, that's not fun. I think I've modified a little bit to fit what I believe, but it's from guilt confession, where that shame is brought out into the light, where we're not no longer isolated. We're actually confessing that, and that it's a whole lot of hurt or frustration. It's not fun stuff, but it gets the end goal of reconciliation, and that's where we need. I thought the goal was always to be sinless, that we were called to be sinless, and that was what was taught a lot from the pulpit. And the reality is we're sinners, and the goal shouldn't be to be sinless; it should be to sin less, because we're always going to sin, but we'll never be sinless. And to me, this whole cycle, or because we'll never be perfect. Empathy is the antidote for shame, meaning that the best way to combat feelings of shame is to experience empathy from others. And I would argue that fits right in the cycle, because that's what Marty termed the whole concept of shame is that guilt is what we did, and shame is who you are. And I would argue that you can't feel shame without guilt. I think you can't. Yeah, you can't. No, you can't feel guilt without shame, but you can feel shame without guilt. And I'll talk about that here in a second here. So I'm pondering through all these things as I'm cycling through this, and the Spirit's nagging me to think about shame, and so I try to identify where does shame occur. And just from my own thoughts, and go through the Bible, there's a lot of instances of shame, and we can have shame from something we've done, a sin we've committed, a failure, a mistake, or maybe even just a misunderstanding. And that shame comes from what we did. It's a reaction to what we did. We can have shame that comes not from our actions, but from who we are. And you think about everything that's going on in our culture right now with the so-called woke movement or whatever is really, it's all about shame. We can get shamed just from being different, from our gender, our ethnicity, or race, our social status. We can be made to feel shame. And that shame is real, and it's not because of anything we did. We can feel the shame of association. I was going to pick on Larry here, but we can feel the shame of association with our family. You know, Jeff Foxworthy always used to tell the joke that every family has that weird uncle or crazy aunt, and if you don't know who that person is in your family, it's probably you. But we do feel shame. We feel shame in association with our family. My brother does something that I don't approve of. I feel that shame. Shame's a powerful, powerful emotion. We can feel the shame of lost relationships, whether it's from divorce or breakup or death. There's that shame there, and it's not from anything that I did, other than they wanted me to move to Florida or to St. Louis, and I refused to do it. So I became expendable. I didn't do anything wrong. I did what was best for my family. And then finally, we can feel shame from abuse, emotional, physical, or sexual. And there are basically three categories of shame, and I'm not going to address the last one because I'm not. And again, there's that cycle of recovery where there's this godly sorrow gives birth to shame, and the shame gives birth to conviction and the confession process. But unfortunately, Satan has his own evolution as well, and he says, "Yeah, I'll give you guilt, the worldly sorrow, but I'll even give you giving you shame, but I'll also give you dissociation, because in our shame, it's really easy just to dissociate, just ignore it. Walk in, I don't want to deal with it, I'm just going to ignore it. I'm going to just make it go away just by not addressing it." Satan says, I can throw in something else, but you shift the blame to somebody else, so you don't have to deal with it. There's no healing, there's no reconciliation. And then finally, the evolution in Satan's life cycle is self-condemnation, where there is no victory. From Brene Brown, it talks about the shame, the fact that it thrives in secrecy and isolation, while empathy creates a space. Through all this thought, I was thinking that, Jesus doesn't really take away our shame in this sense. I think he does take away shame when the shame is from external forces, but he doesn't really take away shame in this life cycle or this evolution of redemption, because it's necessary. To me, that's the point. If you understand that Jesus is trying to help you through the cycle, then you can get from conviction and confession to reconciliation a whole lot faster. But think about how religion works. Our religion in most of our churches, at least my experience in being raised, is there's no solid path. We've been taught in the church that we need to confess our sins, but it's usually in an arena that's not safe. It's an arena that's not really a place where you can feel vulnerable. My own family with my own church family and that sort of thing. And so I'm trying to reconcile my own mind. Why is it so hard for me to get to that next step of conviction and confession? Beat up enough in the past that I don't want it to happen again. And I've had positive experiences where I've been vulnerable, but more often than not, I haven't had that opportunity. And so this morning, I want to encourage everybody else to think about that. I think I've shared what I want to do. It was miserable, and I finally did it. And his response is, "That's okay. I forgive you. We all have our stuff." And to me, that was the shame just melted away. We were on the same. Before I was down here, and I didn't want to even be around the guy because I felt so much shame. To the point where here he blew way out of proportion. It was sin, but it became so large that I couldn't deal with it, and then he just shrank it. And it's a cool process. It's a process that God to feel that shame. He wants us to have excuses. He wants us to blame others. He wants us to dissociate from it. So there's the background. And the text that we're going to be dealing with, a very familiar story to us. It's the story of David and Bathsheba. And the story starts out that, and we know in the story that when he stayed back, he had a lot of idle time. And that idle time came to coveting another man's wife, to getting her pregnant. And at this point, I would argue that David in the sin cycle, or in the recovery stage, the worldly sorrow, because he realizes he's done something wrong. And I say that he's in that worldly sorrow because the next thing he did didn't improve the situation. He decides the way to cover it up, or back home, hoping that he'll sleep with her and think the worldly sorrow. That scheme fails because this guy feels guilty because all his buddies are back fighting the war. And he says, "I'm not going to go. I'm going to sleep on the doorstep because I don't feel like it's right for me to be with my wife when all my buddies are off to war." And that fails, so David has to go ahead with his next plan. So now he plans to have the guy killed in battle. And he orchestrates this whole thing. And again, I think he's probably feeling, he orchestrates the murder of this guy. And again, he's in this redemption cycle, and it's going nowhere. we're good at least. And he, adultery, murder, cover up. And all this happens, and this is, and then we pick it up in the next chapter in 2 Samuel. I want to read. In 2 Samuel, there were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb and said to Nathan, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this, full of sorrow and shame, die. You are an adulterer. You are a murderer." And this process should happen organically on our own right, but David gets to the next step. He says, "You are that man. This is what the Lord says, the God of Israel. I answered his wives in your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why didn't you just kill them with the sword of the Ammonites? Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house. So I'm going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes, I will take your wives and give them to the one who is close to you. This thing in broad daylight before all Israel." Then David said to Nathan, "I've sinned." David had wallowed in the previous steps and got nowhere, and Nathan steps up and says, "Okay, let's move this on." And he got David to move to that step of confession. And they're not done yet. The process isn't finished yet. But we know that the process did finish. It was a beautiful psalm written by David after he had committed the sins with Bathsheba. And at least that's what the title says. And I think it was after the confrontation with Nathan. Because what he expresses in the psalm is beautiful. "Mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion, may it please you to prosper Zion, to build up the wall, and the bulls would be offered on your altar." And you see the transformation at David's heart, and just you can sense the relief in what he's writing. And all that is gone now. But you got to the point of reconciliation. And I love that feeling. It's a feeling we probably don't, I say I have. There's sins that I've committed that it never got to confession, never got to conviction. Missed out on is that whole reconciliation, that light feeling in the heart, where we can go on and feel good about our relationship with God and good about our relationship with others. Got her pregnant and killed her husband. And I think there's so much in life for it that we miss out on because we don't take it to that next level. We don't get to that reconciliation, and it's a shame. We're missing out. So I don't know the science of psychology or sociology or anything like that, but I know what I've experienced in my life and the times I decided not to deal with it. I've started this life cycle of redemption or recovery, and I just didn't complete it. I'm not here to make you feel guilty because I don't want to be the religious guy that heaps guilt on and tries to spirit nag you for a while about where you are in life, where you are in your relationships. It's really